Colleagues, can we all take our seats, please? We're about to kick off. Welcome everybody to this conference on copyright in higher education and research in Europe. My name is Rob Copeland. I'm chair of the Higher Education and Research Standing Committee for ETUCE, one of the main organisers of this conference. And I think there is increasing sense or increasing interest in the issue of copyright in Europe and beyond in relation to the education sector, including in higher education and research. And I think the level of interest in this conference, I think, indicates that. And we have an excellent panel here to start off the discussion. Before then, I just wanted put forward a bit of housekeeping rules. This conference is a bilingual conference in both English and French. So there is translation at the back, and you all have headsets if you require translation. And the second point, I would like to thank the European Union Intellectual Property Office for its financial support for this conference, which I think is a really key one for not just educators, but obviously for citizens more generally in Europe. So I'm delighted that you've been able to support this, as well as, of course, all the other partner organisations. And the format for this morning is we're going to hear from the panellists from the respective organisations with some opening remarks. And then we're going to flow directly to the keynote speech afterwards from the European Commission. So I will now ask Justyna Petsch from the European Intellectual Property Union Intellectual Property Office to start the conference with some opening remarks. Thank you, Justyna.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Indeed, I came here on behalf of Intellectual Property Office, and I'm very proud to say that our office was chosen last year as the most innovative intellectual property office in the world. Our main objective is to raise awareness about intellectual property and fight intellectual property infringements like copyright infringements and piracy. And I must admit that for many years we worked very closely with customs officers, with police, with judges, with prosecutors, and we're focusing a lot on the physical counterfeiting, and we have not realized that actually with only this angle we will not solve the problem of intellectual property infringements, that we have to broaden our perspective and we have to move more into the education field. For the Intellectual Property Office, education field is something that we have not been really exposed to. We have carried out a study to understand a little bit how intellectual property is placed in the educational systems. This study was kind of a revolution for us, because we realized that in the countries which are outside of the EU and which are the most innovative countries in the world, children are learning about respect of intellectual property much earlier in their education than in Europe, even at the age of 6 or 7. So we decided to go to the stakeholders who know about education, which are Ministries of Education. We asked them to come on board and work with intellectual property offices. We created something which is called IP in Education. It's a network of Ministries of Education and intellectual property offices. We meet regularly, and our objectives is twofold. First of all, we work on a policy level So we work actually now in a council on key competences for lifelong learning to make sure that in these key competences intellectual property is well included. And we are working also on the practical level. So we decided that together with the network that there is a lot of resources, a lot of materials out there, but these materials that are teaching intellectual property are very often not adapted to the children. Teachers do not have enough enough training to use these materials. So we decided to map what is out there. We mapped these materials. We went to the European School of Alicante, which is quite exceptional school as the schools here in Brussels, which are the European schools. They have a lot of languages. European School of Alicante has 14 languages. We tested materials with kids, with teachers, and we came to one main conclusion. Teachers. Teachers are extremely important in using materials. If they are not trained how to use them, they are not supportive in using them, and there needs to be a lot of efforts done to create enough support for the teachers. So we are very happy to support this conference. We would like to be an active partner here, to learn a lot and also to use everything that we are going to discuss further in our network to push these conclusions from this conference forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justyna, for those opening remarks, and it's good to hear that you want to get more engaged with the issue of educators in relation to this issue. One housekeeping rule I didn't mention, sorry I forgot at the beginning, is that this conference is being live web streamed, so that colleagues who obviously weren't able to attend are able to see it. I will now pass on to Susan Flocken, European Director of ETUCE, to give a few words on behalf of ETUCE and obviously the perspective of educators in Europe. Susan.
Good morning, colleagues, and good morning, guests and our speakers. I welcome you all. I'm happy to have this opportunity and to be discussing about copyright and education. And I will be giving in particular the perspective of teachers, academics, researchers, and copyright. I will just introduce ETUCE to those who don't know us, as we're a mixed group here with different stakeholders. ETUCE is the European Trade Union Committee for Education. We represent 132 member organizations, that is education trade unions at national level. And that means approximately 11 million teachers in Europe at all levels of education. So starting from early childhood education through to secondary education, vocational education training, and higher education and research. We're a social partner at European level, and our counterpart in the European Sectoral Social Dialogue for Education, EFEE, is also here, so you will be hearing the perspective of the employers in education later. And we're also the European region of Education International, which is working on this topic at international level. So you see the broad span of the work that we're doing. As education trade unions, we represent the voice of teachers in Europe. And for us, the position is very clear concerning copyright, but also education in general. Education is a public good and a human right, and it's not a market commodity. And as such, we need to ensure access to quality education, to quality teaching materials, and to quality teaching tools. that means that we're supporting very much the professional autonomy of teachers to freely choose the means, the appropriate means and media to use when educating. Open education resources and as innovative tool can be supportive to this, so through new technologies, and we welcome this. We also are very well aware that these can be opportunities, and of course there is a big interest of businesses now in education. So we see the big challenge and also the risk for the public good of education to be very much used as a commodity, and the influence of companies in privatizing and commercializing education. And for us, this is a risk because it's we jeopardize the quality of education, but also the teaching and the learning environment of those teaching and learning in education. And we are very well aware that privatization fosters inequalities in education. So we have a big role as education trade unions to address these challenges and to work on this in Europe. Although we're focusing in this conference today on higher education and research, copyright is an issue that is a relevant topic not only in higher education and research, but in all levels of education. As regards intellectual and creative property rights, we're talking about emotional and social intellectual learning, critical thinking, and we're talking very concretely of the work that teachers are doing. So in a school, for example, the simple decision, can I use this material? Am I free to use it? And how can I use it? We have to think in these practical terms when we're discussing maybe a topic that can seem very abstract, or if we're discussing it with a legal perspective. And also when we look at early career researchers, where we often see that they're being asked by the education institutions or the institutions, research institutions they work for, to step back from their intellectual property rights. And this, of course, has concerns also for remuneration and salaries. So too often at European level, we see that the discussion on education and copyright is one of a business approach, when we should really be looking at this emotional and social side of education. And I call on you to really bear in mind these concrete examples of those people who are working in education and who deal with copyright on a daily basis. So for me, this is really an excellent opportunity that we're here together in this event with representatives from all across Europe. So we are really able to have a European discussion here, and also that we are gathering different actors and stakeholders from different backgrounds and different fields. We have teachers here, we have education trade union representatives, students, employers in education, we have the intellectual property officers, and representatives from the European institutions. So we're really a high-level conference today here. And for us, this means that we have a good basis, and I wish us all that we really have good discussions, that we take back inspiration from this meeting to the work that we're doing concretely back home, and also, of course, with a big being conscious that the directive on copyright is in its final stages. So we are really can use this opportunity here with the exchange of views to prepare our advocacy in this last stage on on the Directive of Copyright. And in particular also, as we have the opportunity today to discuss with a representative of the European Parliament who's doing the report on the copyright issue, we really have an excellent opportunity today. So I wish you a good conference and look forward to the discussions we'll be having today.
Thank you, Susan, for your remarks, including reference to the fact that copyright is an issue not just in the higher education sector, but also in the school sector as well, and for also highlighting the kind of political saliency of this issue at the moment in Europe in relation to the directive. I'll now pass on to Daniel Wisniewski, who is the General Secretary of EFEE, the European Federation of Education Employers, to give the perspective of education institutions and education ministries on the issue of copyright. So, Daniel.
I don't know if I can speak on behalf of education ministries, but I certainly will present our point of view as on a basis of our network. And for those of you who are not familiar with EFEE, we are a network of currently 39 different institutions from 22 European countries. This network is very diverse. We represent employers, but in different countries, employers in education are different institutions. And so among our membership, we have governmental employers associations, we have local and regional authorities, we have also ministries of education, as well as school heads associations, depending on the country. And therefore, we are a very interesting mix of different institutions representing all levels of education, from pre-primary to higher education and research. And I am very happy to be part of this discussion on copyrights. I think that at the European level, there's lots of things going on already. As Susan mentioned, we are in the midst of a new directive on copyrights. We certainly, as education employers, would look for a clear framework that would strike a balance between individual copyrights and the rights of those who produce content, and of course the content users. As Susan mentioned, it's very important in education that not only science but knowledge in general is open, is an open source, and is actually a key aspect in for the development of European Union and our societies. I think that it's a great opportunity also to collect your points of view on this issue, because together with ETUCE we have a pleasure to manage a European sectoral social dialogue in education as the employees and employers here in Brussels, that is managed and carried out with support of the DG Employment and Social Inclusion. And we hope that this topic will also be part of our discussion within the social dialogue. So this conference, apart from launching or let's say carrying out a fruitful discussion on what should be the new model, or what should be the model for the copyrights in Europe, is also feeding into our work of the working group on higher education that we also have. We have a very specific working group devoted only to higher education members. So for those of you who are trade unions or so the employee side or employees in education, we certainly invite you to join. It will take place in September this year. I think that that's it. I wish us a fruitful conference. I hope that I'm looking forward to learn more from your models, and I will give some final remarks at the end of this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and particularly your point about the links between this issue and social dialogue and in relation to higher education. I think that's an important dimension that we need to take into account if possible today. I'm now going to move on to our next panelist, and obviously the issue of copyright is of importance to not just educators but wider citizens in Europe. And I'm delighted that we have Aleksander Tarkowski, the director of COMMUNIA, which is one of the kind of key NGOs active on this issue. So, Aleksander, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here today. I represent COMMUNIA, the European Association on the Digital Public Domain. We're a membership organization. Our members come from the broadly understood access to knowledge and users' rights sector. Organizations such as Creative Commons, Wikimedia, also Dutch think tank Kennisland, or my organization in Poland, Centrum Cyfrowe. So we work often with the educational sector, but we are ourselves largely not educators. And for this reason, it is very important for us to build ties with the educational sector, and that's why I'm so very happy to be here. Why do we need to build these ties? As COMMUNIA, we believe in flexible copyrights and copyright that respects user rights, that strikes a good balance for innovation and creativity in Europe. And we believe that copyright is an issue that is not just limited to the cultural or creative sphere, but that affects research, education, science, and basically all spheres of life today. In copyright debates, which we have been following in Europe during the ongoing work on the new directive for several years, often we are focusing on copyright policy. So we're asking questions, what's the good balance between rights holders and users of copyrighted works? But in this approach, education is just one of many spheres where resources are being used. And at some point we realized this is not enough, that we would like to change this discussion, and that we would also like to bring educational stakeholders to this debate, because we felt around 2016 that really their voice is not yet heard enough. We especially felt, and I felt personally, that the teacher unions are obviously important. And I had a personal experience about 2 years ago. I participated in an OECD summit in Helsinki on education. It was educational organizations and industry meeting together, and the International Education International Federation was there, and I really appreciated their very brave and very strong views in defense of public education. And I felt these are the people we need to be working with. So, you know, for me, this is sort of a dream come true, that through some very good fortune, we managed to build these ties, and together we, and I personally, am here. 2 years ago, we started building a coalition of educational stakeholders, a network of stakeholders that speaks with a shared voice on these issues. In debates happening, for instance, in the European Parliament, we count together around 50 organizations, and we believe that we need to be discussing how to build a copyright that serves good education. Because in Europe, we talk a lot that we need digital skills, that we need creative workforce, that we need innovative workforce. But so in order to do that, these people need to be educated, or they need to educate themselves. And in such education, we cannot be burdened by educators having to ask, am I breaking the law if I want to use really modern resources? Will I run into trouble if I do what media education teaches me to do? I want to share resources, I want to be creative. We really need the copyright that supports teachers in this regard, instead of causing them potential problems. This is, of course, also an issue of educating teachers. This is the work we really appreciate that EUIPO is leading. So this voice is very much needed. This is the voice of educators, of researchers, of scientists. I want to, by the way, mention that today a campaign called Vox Scientia is launching. It's a campaign which tries to highlight these voices in the ongoing copyright debate. One other voice that is very needed is the voice of ministries of education. I want to note this. This is a partner that we feel is crucial. These ministries are often not involved in this debate because, due to the division of competences, copyright is not seen as their competence. But as I mentioned, it has to be seen. It has to be seen as a dimension of educational policy. That's why we're, for instance, very happy that today we'll have representatives of the Slovenian Ministry of Education, Science and Sport. Finally, I want to say that we need to remember about the broader perspective. Debates about copyright and education are happening today not only in Europe, they're happening in India, South Africa, Canada, Australia. Kyrgyzstan recently reformed its copyright law in a way that really supports the educational system, and we need to be mindful of that. Important discussions on a minimal standard for educational exceptions are taking place in EUIPO, and I really hope as Europeans, as European organizations, we all sort of take responsibility for this broader global perspective and be involved in these discussions. And finally, I want to say that I also hope that educators, representatives of educational institutions will remain involved in copyright debates. I know this is an issue that is sometimes challenging, that is very expert-driven and complicated, but it's also an issue that's crucial for education. And it's an issue where I believe we need to take care that copyright is well balanced with educational policy and the good of education. And in order to do that, we need to have your voice heard loudly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aleksander, for highlighting the need of kind of for broader partnerships in relationship to this issue of copyright and intellectual property, but also your reference to the global dimension, beyond Europe, which kind of links in rather neatly to our final speaker, which is Haldis Holst, Deputy General Secretary of Education International, the Global Federation of Education Workers. And Haldis is obviously going to say something about the more global aspects. So, Haldis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rob, and good morning to all of you, and welcome to this conference. First, I would like to thank the conveners for actually putting this conference on the agenda and making this happen. I think that's extremely important and extremely timely. As Aleksander said, this is not just a topic for the European region. This is a global topic, and as a global union federation, the ETUCE is one of our 5 regions, but we know that this debate is going on in all the regions in different fashions. But it's important to remember, because you can't lock Europe into a silo and think that what you decide here only has a consequence for Europe. That has a consequence for the greater world, because you're part of the greater world, the same way it does in other regions. And also that, which has been highlighted before here, that although you are focusing on higher education, this is relevant for the full education sector that we represent from early childhood up through, of course, and through to adult education and the lifelong learning perspective. An awful lot of is said. Now I'd like to add a couple of comments, but I'm going to start a bit personal because I'm not an expert on copyright. I find this sometimes so extremely complicated that you tend to sometimes sort of back off. And I think that is some of our challenge, that we have to make this accessible so that it is a tool for everyone in their professional life. Whether you are a creator that need to be protected by copyright, or whether you are a user and need to respect the copyright rules. And I think Justyna said it correctly here, that is also about, for our perspective, for teachers and other education personnel to have some confidence that they're doing the right thing, at the same time that the rules are created in such a way that they actually can do a professional job. I'm old enough that when I started as a teacher at a combined primary and lower secondary school, we had just purchased our first copying machine. You know, the kind of thing where we had to have a key to get into the headmaster's office and justify why we wanted to make a copy to use in the classroom. But those were the first discussions I was part of. What are we allowed to copy? What kind of text or pictures or whatever can I take into the classroom? I was also then working in a society that had the highest density at that time of video machines, beta machines, of course, that they shouldn't have bought. They should have bought the VHS. And then the next question was, you know, what can we record? What can we show in the classroom? So yes, it's new, but it's also an old problem of what can you reproduce for which purpose. Later in my career, when I turned into a full-time trade unionist, I did, sometimes wrote pieces for our union magazine that was independent. And I wrote a piece, and one of them, and some time went past, and suddenly I got this letter in my mailbox. And the letter was followed by a check. because the text that I had written had actually been used for an exam paper in upper secondary education, and I was paid for it. I was paid for the copyright for my intellectual property. That made me reflect a bit. I was rather proud that I'd written something that was perceived as good enough to be used as an exam paper. But then I started thinking, how many exam papers do the Norwegian authorities produce for lower secondary and upper secondary every year? How many texts do they use? And what does it cost them to pay to use those texts for exam papers? A non-commercial purpose, an educational purpose, and you know, I can even add that just the PR of getting your text on an exam paper has quite a value. And really, the feeling of receiving that money wasn't quite the same when you started thinking about it. Because I'm not too sure if I think that it's right that you have to pay for that. Well, as I said, we're far on from the copying machine and the beta video machines. We're in a much more globalized world. We have the World Wide Web and Google in the classrooms. We have trade agreements. We have commercial, non-commercial platforms for sharing of materials. We have social media. The world is in many ways more open than ever. The access is right there on your lap all the time. I don't know how many of you have devices in front of you now, probably most of you. And you may be multitasking. You may actually be reading something right now out there for your own use. And it's the same our students are in the classroom. And where a teacher or a professor or whatever is going to try to guide these students through it. And I think we're also in the world that the more open it becomes, the more need we feel to build traffic rules, to build barriers, to sort of close ourselves in, to be sure that we have some kind of control of what's going on. And to me, that's part of the copyright debate that is going on. And it's also why I want to emphasize that you mustn't go down a route where you try to close Europe off from the rest of the world. Because you can't do that, but you have to find a fair way of interacting. Because intellectual property is worth a lot. And it's not just about a digital divide between north and south and rich and poor, but it's also about an intellectual divide. And if you close in everything Europe has of intellectual property and not make it access to the rest of the world, then we are closing off these children and young people from accessing the same quality education. Because it is about quality content. We've had all the debates about fake news. There's more than enough information out there that everyone can access for free. So it's also about what kind of information and text do you want students and pupils to actually have access for as part of their education. That we have rules that make it possible for everyone to have a quality content within their classroom. I'm looking forward to listening to you and more of your expert knowledge than what I have, asking more questions. How do we actually make this work in a fair way, where we are respecting the creator and we're also respecting the user, and we're respecting that education is not just about an individual achieving something, it's about building societies for a collective good for all of our knowledge. How do we make these traffic rules? How do we make them work? So that we're not making it more difficult, so that we are not enhancing that some people are making profit off other people's intellectual property without it being fair. So I will listen to you, and I wish you all the luck through the day, and hope it will be a very constructive conference that will come out energized with loads of new ideas. So thank you and good luck.
Thank you, Haldis, for mentioning the kind of historical dimension to these debates, the way that technology is changing a lot, but some of the issues at stake have been around quite a long time. And also, of course, for mentioning the broader dimension beyond Europe again. So that's the end of the panel session for this morning. I would like to thank all the contributors for their opening remarks, and I'm sure many of the issues raised now will be taken up during the future sessions today. We are now going to move to the keynote address, and I'd like to welcome Thomas Ewert, who's the Legal and Policy Officer in DG Connect as part of the European Commission. So, Thomas, please, welcome.
Yes, good morning. My name is Thomas Ebert. Thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation. In fact, many of you will know I'm replacing my head of unit today, Marco Giorello, who was announced, but couldn't come, unfortunately, because today the Council Working Party on Copyright is meeting to discuss the directive one more time. So he cannot make it, couldn't make it, and I, unfortunately, will not be able to stay after this presentation either. But I'm very happy to speak here today on this very relevant topic for us. And please allow me to briefly introduce myself a bit in terms of what I'm dealing with. I joined the copyright unit of the European Commission around 2.5 years ago. That means roughly 1 year in advance of the adoption of our copyright proposal package. So right in the middle of the preparations, you could say. And I'm dealing, among other things, predominantly with exceptions and limitations in the directive, but also as regards WIPO, WIPO, where I've also had the chance to often see COMMUNIA side events, because COMMUNIA, of course, is very active, very good there. And yes, that being said, I would like to recap briefly the background of the reform. Many of you will know this, so I'll be quick. Of course, the copyright reform is anchored in the digital single market strategy of the Commission, and one of the overall objectives is to provide better access to content and to take into account digital and online developments. One of the key steps to get to the adoption of the proposals was our communication in December 2015, setting a bit the narrative, explaining what was about to come and explaining the considerations underlying the proposals. It was accompanied by the portability regulation, which I just mentioned very briefly here because it just was became applicable 2 weeks ago, which is our first instrument that now entered into force and became applicable out of the reform proposal, so we're quite happy and proud about that. And then the second copyright package, of which the directive forms part as well. The second package, in fact, consisted of 4 proposals, and I will be brief again. The most relevant for you and for us today is, of course, the directive, with the exception for teaching in Article 4 and TDM in Article 3. But it was also accompanied by the so-called online set-cap regulation, which also is still under negotiations, and the implementation of the Marrakesh Treaty for blind people. And the Marrakesh implementation has been finalized. The deadline for the transposition of the directive is on the 12th of October. And I just mentioned it briefly here because I thought that actually this may be relevant for blind students in particular cases as well, because the directive or the treaty generally allows for the production and dissemination of books in accessible format copies for blind and visually impaired people. On the directive, roughly 3 objectives and 3 chapters. First one, modernizing key exceptions and research and education. Research, I mentioned TDM already, education, Article 4, and preservation, maybe not so relevant here today. I will discuss in more detail in the next slides. Just to say, the other chapters follow the logic to facilitate licenses and ensure wider access to content, and introducing fairer rules of the game for a better functioning copyright marketplace, often also referred to as closing the value gap. Now, on the exceptions, it's important to know the background a little bit, because in the EU copyright framework, we have a large catalog of optional exceptions in the 2001 Directive on Copyright in the Information Society, the so-called InfoSoc Directive. But in many cases, the optionality and the fact that they're a little bit dated, predating the digital environment, digital developments largely, led to uncertainties and the need for reform in our assessment. So what we did was to propose mandatory exceptions for education, for research, and for preservation. For teaching, we had, of course, the old exception for illustration for teaching, but in our view, in our assessment, the main problem with this exception and its implementation in the member states was that teachers and students face legal uncertainty when using content in digitally supported teaching practices, in particular online and across borders. And therefore, in the impact assessment, we assessed different options how to tackle this problem. 3 options in particular. The first one was to foster a stakeholder dialogue and member states guidance to raise awareness among stakeholders, teachers, and educational establishments to address these problems. The second one was a mandatory exception for digital uses for the purpose of illustration for teaching, including across borders. And the third one was also the mandatory exception, but complemented with provision, with the possibility for member states to make the exception partially or completely subject to the availability of licenses. And as I think you all know, we went for the third option, because in the assessment of the Commission, this was deemed to be the option to achieve legal certainty for addressing the objective or the problem that was identified, while at the same time limiting negative impacts on rights holders. Now, of course, this also has to be seen against the situation in the member states that is existing today. As a matter of fact, we have several member states that have ECL, extended collective licensing systems in place that work rather well, and had an interest in keeping these schemes. Of course, if you propose a mandatory exception that overrides any contract, any license, this would have been difficult. Other member states, particularly the UK, have exceptions in place that are subject to licenses. And other member states, again, that do not have these license prevalence have carve-outs of the exception for educational material or textbooks or music sheets, like in Germany, where I'm from, or in Austria. This is very common. And to allow for this possibility to member states to have a limited carve-out of the exception for in an area where adequate licenses are available was a way to help these member states to adjust their systems. That being said, in the proposal, we have placed an obligation on member states to ensure visibility and availability of adequate licenses. So it's not just saying the exception doesn't apply where there are licenses, but the member states have to do something to make them visible, findable for educational institutions. Other main features of the exception to the extent that member states have implemented it cannot be overridden by contract, and member states can put optional compensation in place, which is also a feature that is existing today in many member states. Now, as regards the discussions in the Council and the EP, because as you know, the negotiations are ongoing since 1.5 years already. Unfortunately, I'm not able to give you the latest news from the engine room, but I think you have speakers later today. I think the rapporteur from jury will be here that may give you a bit the gist. But what is publicly known is, for instance, what was discussed in the Council as regards Article 4. And this I can perhaps briefly tell you about. In the Council, the exception in Article 4 was largely supported, I can say. I think it's fair to say. And relatively small changes have been proposed that focused more or less on clarifications. For instance, on as you know, the exception for digital activities had in our proposal the concept of secure electronic networks, which means that education establishments have to ensure some kind of secured networks when students and teachers use online environments for teaching. And in the Council now, in the latest proposal, it has been clarified that this can be a password-protected environment as opposed to something that the educational establishment must host itself. Yes, that being said, I would like to say briefly a few words about text and data mining as well, which is in Article 3. I think it's more of a marginal interest here, but it is also of relevance for universities, at least, and possibly even high schools where there is research being done. The TDM exception that we proposed is a targeted exception limited to public interest research organizations, and thereby focusing, in essence, researchers in universities and research organizations, allowing them to carry out text and data mining, for instance, when they have subscriptions to scientific journals and where there is a lack of legal certainty whether these activities are allowed. It is a mandatory exception for member states as well, and there can be no contractual override. This is a common feature in our exceptions. Again, this exception has also been supported mainly in the Council, and by now the text can be considered quite stable. What we have seen was a slight extension of the beneficiaries in Council from research organizations to cultural heritage institutions, such, for instance, as national libraries. And indeed, this has been also present in the EP and some of the opinions of the opinion-giving committees, for instance, IMCO, whereas other committees have extended this exception to startups. Now, that being said, the discussion is still ongoing between the co-legislators in the Council. It was mentioned already initially that we are nearing the final stages of the discussion, at least at the technical level. In the EP, the situation is a bit different. There has been a lot of discussion, of course, already, and the opinion-giving committees have by now all given their opinions, such as, for example, IMCO, ITRE, as I mentioned. But the lead committee is Jury, the Committee on Legal Affairs, and its vote is still pending. We're waiting for that. And perhaps the rapporteur can update you on that, on the timing for this. What is very important in our view is the last bullet point here now, because as you all know, probably the mandate for the Commission and the EP finishes next year with the new elections. So in order to wrap this up, to be ready and to finalize, we think it's crucial that in the second half of this year that the negotiations are finalized as far as possible, because we must not forget that the finalization and adoption of a legislation at EU level also takes a few administrative steps afterwards, which we tend to forget a little bit, but these are not to be taken lightly. So we are getting a bit under time pressure, and now I think it's also fair to say the institutions fully realize this, and everybody's working under high pressure. But just to give you the flavor a little bit, that there is a sense of urgency now in the air, I would say. Thank you very much.
Thank Thank you very much, Thomas, for a very clear overview of the current policy and also the process. And as Thomas said, we have an in-depth discussion of this issue after the coffee break, where there will also be an opportunity for questions and comments. But thank you, Thomas, for giving the keynote. So colleagues, that's the end of this session. So now we're going to move to the next panel. So the panelists who are due to come on, if you can swap over. And we're going to look a little bit more at the diversity of copyright models, primarily in Europe. As Thomas said, there is a diversity with member states in Europe, but also we're going to have a contribution from outside Europe as well to give that kind of global perspective. So again, I'd like to thank the panelists here and to welcome the new panelists onto the table. Thank you. Okay, colleagues, so we will now kick off having a little bit more in-depth look at some sort of national case studies, highlighting some of the kind of pros and cons of different copyright models. And the first speaker, I'm delighted, is David Robinson, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of University Teachers, who is going to tell us something about issues in relation to Canada and copyright. So, David, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Rob, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. Some of you may know we have a relatively noisy neighbor to the south, and it's nice to get away and into the peace and quiet of Brussels once in a while. So thank you so much for that. Just quickly, the Canadian Association of University Teachers is for the, I assume most of you have no idea who we are. We are an affiliate of Education International. We represent academic staff, professors, academic librarians, instructors at universities and colleges across Canada. And our members, oddly enough, and surprisingly to me, are passionate about this issue. They love endless discussions of copyright, which often for me is a great cure for insomnia, but they certainly seem to get really worked up about this, because for them, in the everyday work that they do, copyright matters. Their ability to access, use, and control their work is something that is quite important for them. So I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about Canada and our attempts at copyright modernization, and I hope to try and dispel some of the myths that are propagated internationally about what's actually happening in Canada following the reform of copyright, particularly in the education sector, where a lot of the controversy has arisen. But before I do that, I just want to mention that for us as an organization and for our members, copyright is always a question of balance, about balancing different kinds of interests, of owners' rights versus user rights, private individual rights versus the public good, economic rights versus social and cultural rights. And in this debate, educators, I think, and this is one of the key messages I'd want to leave with you, is that educators play a fairly unique role in this debate, because we are both heavy users of and also heavy producers of creative material. So we have an interest that straddles, I think, both of these issues. I think that's really important to keep in mind. So let's talk about copyright reform. What did Canada do? It took us 12 years to get this. It was a long process. It started off with some missteps, but essentially it began as implementation of these new treaties within the World Intellectual Property Office. Oops, I'm just going too far. It started off as a EUIPO implementation process, and then led to a broader debate about modernizing copyright. There were multiple bills, multiple governments that came and went. We had national consultations, and we finally had a substantive bill that was produced in 2010, and hearings in 2011, and finally we got a bill in 2012. And it was during this period that my organization, CAT, and the Canadian Federation of Students, representing students at universities and colleges, was really active in trying to shape the outcome of the bill. In the end, we got a bill that was not perfect, but I think made some important steps. While this was happening, meanwhile at the Supreme Court, there were a number of decisions that were coming down that were shaping the legislation. And in particular, I won't go through all the details. This would be really boring. But one, there was a case involving an art gallery and the use of an artist's work, and the court, I think, came up with an interesting and at that time a relatively groundbreaking decision, noting that excessive control of copyright and other forms of intellectual property would unduly hinder the ability of the public to incorporate and establish creative innovation. So this was one of the first decisions that came down on user rights. This happened in 2002 while the debate was happening. We also had a groundbreaking case in 2004 involving fair dealing, which is really the story I'm going to tell in a moment and explain what fair dealing is. And finally, in 2012, just as the act was coming into force, we had what was called the copyright Pentalogy agreements. There were 5 cases that the Supreme Court took on all at once and identified the use of copyright material for education purposes as covered by fair dealing. This was for the first time, because normally it had been private study had been determined. So the Supreme Court was expanding the notions of fair dealing as well. And then finally, in 2012, we got the Copyright Act, and the Act took into account some of these legal cases and expanded the scope of fair dealing, sometimes called fair use or fair practice, to include education, amongst other things. The Act allows educational institutions or a person acting under its authority, a teacher, for instance, a student, to reproduce a work in order to display it for educational purposes. And it allows librarians to reproduce works in their permanent collection in alternate formats if the original format is obsolete. So to take Haldis' example, taking a VHS tape and transforming it into a digital format so that it can be preserved. You don't need prior permission or payment to do that now. The key element to this, and there were lots of other elements of the Copyright Act that I won't go into the details about, and there were some problems with it as well, but for the education community, this expansive notion of fair dealing became quite important. And immediately, there's a lot of misinformation about what fair dealing is. But I just want to leave you with one key message, and that is fair dealing is not free dealing. It does not mean that you can pirate whatever you want. There are very strict conditions placed upon the use of fair dealing in the education setting or elsewhere. But fair dealing in the Canadian context refers to a right within limits to reproduce works without permission or payment for the purposes of research, private study, education, parody, satire, criticism, review, and reporting. What's important is that the bullets or the bolded elements there were new elements added to the Copyright Act in 2012. So some examples of how fair dealing would apply in the education sector. If you're a teacher and you're discussing current affairs, you may photocopy or distribute copies of a single newspaper article and have students talk about it without getting permission or paying the publisher. You can copy a portion of a work, but not its entirety. In Canada, the rule generally, and it's always contextual, is about 10%. So a single article from a book or a journal, a chapter of a book, a poem, or one or two poems in a collection, but it's not the whole work generally. Now there are exceptions, but and also the courts will also look at what was the purpose of the use, and generally if it's for a non-commercial purpose, there's more leeway given to fair dealing. So in the education context, if you charge students for the photocopy you made of the newspaper article, you may get into trouble. But if you hand it out freely, it's generally accepted as fair dealing. Very important for teachers because it allows teachers to incorporate in the classroom current materials and without permission or payment or waiting to see whether they can use it. So it has very important pedagogical values. It's important for students as well. And that's why we were very active with the Students' Federation in pushing for this expanded notion of fair dealing. So immediately after 2012, then the next fight begins. Many universities and colleges took the Supreme Court cases, took the new Copyright Act as license to end their agreements with collective licensing agencies. We have in Canada a collective licensing agency called Access Copyright. In Quebec, it's called CopyBec. Educational institutions have to pay a per student levy or tax almost, and that allows them to access material which they already have access to. It's a great scheme if you're part of the licensing agency. It's not great if you're a student or an educational institution, particularly at times when budgets are tight. Licensing agencies are increasing their fees astronomically, which is affecting our ability to provide good quality public education. So there's a real extortionist kind of mentality at play. So many universities and colleges said, you know what, we're not going to pay the tariff anymore, we're not going to pay the levy, and we're going to negotiate individual licenses and develop our fair dealing guidelines to provide students and teachers with guidelines on how they can use fair dealing. The collective licensing agencies weren't very happy about that. CopyBec and Access Copyright launched legal challenges and a very aggressive public relations campaign. One of the things in the Copyright Act of 2012 was a requirement that the Act be reviewed in 5 years. And we're in that process right now. In fact, parliamentary hearings begin next week, so the climate of debate is quite intense right now. And more recently, Access Copyright took York University to court. York University, based in Toronto, a large comprehensive institution, had opted out of the collective licensing agreement. They won at a lower court, which is no surprise to us because in Canada our lower courts are terrible because they don't read decisions from the Supreme Court. So we, again, along with the students, are appealing to the Supreme Court of Canada, which will likely hear this later this year, early next year. We fully expect to win. This happens all the time. It happened in all the previous cases as well. But part of the PR campaign were outrageous headlines like this. Kids will suffer if we don't change the Copyright Act. You know, oh my God, not the kids. The kids are suffering. We got to do something. A lot of misinformation, a lot of rhetoric out there that has caused, I think, some concern amongst other jurisdictions looking in at Canada, thinking, my God, what's happening to Canada? And more recently, Cambridge University Press, in testimony before the Fair Trade Commission in Australia, made a series of claims that since the Copyright Act of 2012 and fair dealing guidelines in Canada, Oxford University Press has withdrawn from the market. Nelson, the largest the largest publisher, has declared bankruptcy. Local publishers such as Eamon have ceased publishing, and McGraw-Hill and Pearson have scaled back their operations. So you think that, my God, this is the end of scholarly publishing in Canada. Well, there's a little bit of rhetoric here. The reality is, when you look at it, is Eamon is still publishing, contrary to the claims earlier, and I think the president of Eamon paraphrasing Mark Twain, said, the rumors of our death are greatly exaggerated. They're still around. Oxford University Press reported a decade-long decline in the scholarly publishing market. And that's prior to the 2012 Act. So there's a long-term trend at play. Pearson also experienced long-term declines prior to the 2012 Act. What's interesting is both Oxford and Pearson, however, are showing increased digital sales. And I think this is really what's going on, is we're seeing shifts in the market. And Nelson actually, in its problems come from a failed merger that led to a huge debt problem and had nothing to do with fair dealing. And in fact, if you ask what is really happening, the CEO of Nelson Canada, in testimony in an affidavit in the court hearings around their bankruptcy protection, talked about one of the key issues being that there's been a contraction in the K-12, that is the primary secondary school market, because the way education works in Canada is provinces are responsible in the primary and secondary sector for the curriculum. And curriculum gets sort of redeveloped every 5 to 10 years. And whenever it's redeveloped, then there's a need for new textbooks and materials. But in between those periods, there's no need. They use the same textbooks and materials. So there's less purchasing. So there's kind of a cyclical purchase that's happening. And so he points out that's really what is affecting the primary and secondary market right now, is there's reduced spending from the provinces. And in higher education, he points out that there's a shift to open textbooks, more digital distribution. That's the major issue, not fair dealing. And in fact, if you look at some of the numbers, this is from just an example from Ryerson University. You see library expenditures are continuing to rise, but when you break that down, I know it's going to be a little bit hard to see, but if you look at the print acquisitions, they're going down, but the e-books and the databases are going up. So we're actually seeing a shift in the way in which publishers are distributing materials. So it's not that fair dealing means the end of the textbook. There's broader forces in the marketplace. So I guess the lessons from Canada, I'm contractually obligated to show one iconic image. You can't blame fair dealing, that it's really the digital distribution that's fundamentally changing the market. And fair dealing in Canada is actually far more broad than it is in the United States or in other jurisdictions. In Israel, for instance, fair dealing guidelines are you can use up to 20% of a work. Canada, it's 10%. And finally, I think that one of the really important points, again, that I mentioned earlier, but I want to leave you with, is that fair dealing is really important for educators and for students. It allows us to do the work we need to do. It allows us to be innovative. It allows us to adopt new pedagogical strategies. It's absolutely critical for us, but it's also, I think, in the public interest. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for highlighting the evolution of fair dealing in Canada, and also some of the challenges posed to that with other actors in the process, and particularly in relation to the changes in the publishing industry. We're now going to move back to Europe and to hear another perspective from the educator side, and we're going to hear about the Swedish copyright model from Karin Amosa, who is the head of research and international affairs at the Swedish University Teachers and Researchers. Karin, over to you.
Thank you very much. How do I change the pictures? Okay. So I hope I will be able to. So first, thank you for inviting me to this conference. I'm not an expert in copyright, but I think that in these times everyone who works with higher education policy making, and I do, needs to have a lot of knowledge in this area. So for me this is a great learning opportunity as well. I will speak obviously from a union perspective. I will speak about some general copyright principles in the Swedish labor market. I will speak about some special rules that applies to the academic sector, and I will speak about the special case of Lund University, where we had a disagreement about the teacher's exemption and what it might mean. And since I'm not fortunate enough to speak in my mother tongue, I will try to keep a little bit to my manuscript, because otherwise it will take whole day, I guess. So, and I see if I can change the picture. Yes, good. So, in the Swedish labor market, there are some general copyright principles. The Copyright Act, it does not contain a general rule about employee copyright. If there's no explicit agreement that regulates copyright in an employment relationship, instead, as a rule, the Swedish labor market applies in principle an unwritten rule, and it's known as the rule of thumb. And it came into use in legislative history, copyright literature, and court practice. So the result of employment obligation is defined as material the employee creates when performing their normal duties or according to specific instructions from the employer. That is the general rule. When it comes to universities and colleges, the rule of thumb usually applies only to materials produced within the administrative part of a university teacher's work. This may, for example, occur in the performance of duties as a head of department or director of studies or something like that. It may also apply to schedules, syllabuses, course information that a university teacher has produced. And the rule of thumb, it does not usually include educational material that the employee has created, because this is, in most cases, covered by what is known as the teacher's exemption. And this concept is obviously a translation from Swedish, where the concept is called lärarundantaget, for those of you who might understand Swedish. So I'm not sure if it's better to use teacher's exemption or exception. I would use exemption, and I would try to explain what I mean. So, there is a special rule that applies to the academic sector. The teacher's exemption is an unwritten legal rule based on long tradition, which has developed through custom. And this means that at Swedish universities, the copyright of teaching or educational materials, such as articles, lectures, exercises, compendiums, etc., etc., it belongs to those who work there as teachers and as researchers. And it does not belong to the university, the employer. So what are the reasons then for the teacher's exemption? That includes, among other things, the distinctive employment conditions at universities characterized by widespread working freedoms, known as academic freedom. In education, it means that the department merely decides the extent of the teaching obligations, of course, within the framework of current working hours agreements, while the teacher, her or himself, has the right to design the teaching and educational materials. Another reason is, and this is an important one, that education must rest on a scientific basis, and the teacher who has created the educational material is responsible for its quality and its reflection of current research. And the teacher or the producer of the material is the only one who can actually do that. The copyright teacher's exemption at universities, it can also be traced through literature and legislative history to older copyright legislation as far back as 1914, so it's more than 100 years old by now. According to the teacher's exemption, the teacher's permission is required for a university to gain access to copyrighted materials such as any educational materials that I just mentioned. The requirement for permission also applies to changes to or transfer of the material, as well as to recording and digital dissemination of the material. But authorization is not required for the products of administrative duties. So, but increasingly, higher education institutions in Sweden, due to digital developments, are attempting to introduce restrictions to the teacher's copyright through the creation of different kinds of general policies or general advice on copyright. And I will give you the example of Lund University's general advice just in a second. And and this development has often been caused by the ever-increasing number of distance education and commissioned training courses via internet. And these policies often mean that the university allows the teacher's exemption to include research material, but not teaching material. So I'm going to give you an example of this. In August 2017, Lund University, after co-determination negotiations with the unions, took a decision to issue general advice on the use of copyrighted material. This general advice has been sent to employed teachers at the university. And I also need to say that the negotiations ended in disagreement from our side. And there are several similar policies at other universities. And the risk, we see that the risk of this practice spreading to other universities is high. Lund University states that the policy is a clarification of the university's long-term perception of its prevailing application of the Copyright Act. In the policy, it appears that the requirement for level of originality is higher than is actually required by the Copyright Act. And SULF, which is my union, we believe that the level of originality requirement is very low in practice, and that in principle that everything that a university teacher produces achieves this level and is thus copyrighted if it's not administrative. So, on the other hand, Lund University states that they have the right of use to what a teacher is expected to produce within the framework of her or his teaching duties. An example of this is the teaching material that the university needs in order to provide continuous and effective teaching. And the university think that as soon as such material is made available to others for educational purposes, a right of use arises to the material for Lund University. SULF, the union, does not share this view, and we argue that Lund University's right of use requires agreement with the copyright holder, that is the teacher or the researcher. As far as research material is concerned, Lund University also states that it has the right of use to what a teacher produces in research if it takes place within a specific task or after specific instructions from the employer, or such as the teacher produces for use in the university's own activities. Among other things, they stipulate that if the material produced in research or teaching is subject to contractual agreement with an external party, then what is stated is in that contract applies. SILF believes that an agreement with the copyright holder is required if the right of use is to be transferred. Sorry for that. So, to summarize what I just said, what we see in Sweden currently is the teacher's exemption being under threat in higher education. And this is because the teacher exemption is based on custom, not law. Universities are making their own policies that contradicts the custom of teacher's exemption. If the teacher's exemption is not used, it will no longer be a custom. And unions like us can no longer claim this rule. Therefore, we call on our members to report infringements of the teacher's exemption so that we can go in and negotiate specific cases. And it's important that we do that also in small cases. So lastly, this is just a bit of text from our website, what we tell our members, that if they experience infringement of the teacher's exemption, we tell them that they shall contact their local union representatives, make it very clear to the employer that they are not willing to give up the copyright, and also remember that they can always get support by the union. I think we have to be really clear on this, because members are sometimes, I must say, sometimes they are very naive, and they tend to sign contracts just to be able to go on doing what they love to do, doing research and teach. And since we have this situation with a lot of short-term contracts, and especially on the research side, they will not get the money if they don't sign the contracts, so they do that. And that is also what's happening, is that this custom is going out of service. So, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Karin, for illustrating the Swedish example, but also the extent to which it is a matter for industrial relations. It is a matter of collective bargaining, and that there are conflicts that exist at an institutional level between staff and the institutions. Which brings us to the next speaker, which is now going to be the institutional perspective more. And I'm delighted that we have Joseph Ryan, who's the General Secretary of the Technological Higher Education Association in Ireland. And Joseph is going to say something about the Irish copyright model. Joseph.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to conveners for the invitation to be here, just joining with earlier speakers in that, and particularly to Daniel from EFEE for the invitation. I'm just struck, Chair, by listening the value of networking generally, and what we learn from one another as we have these conversations, and how similar many of our experiences are. And as you've said, my perspective is the opposite one perhaps to Karin's, but we'll see how it might marry up. I'm going to approach this slightly differently through 3 vignettes and then just some reflections. The first vignette is really around James Joyce. Irish people are, we have a real attachment to the writer James Joyce, and particularly those of us who come from Dublin. We feel he's part of our background, of our culture. And any of you who've read Joyce or been interested in it will know that Joyce only came out of copyright in 2012. And there had been numerous battles over copyright, even to the extent, which was very interesting, that on the 100th anniversary of Bloom's Day itself in 2004, there had been a whole series of public readings, simply readings from Ulysses, which were set to take place throughout Dublin. And they were blocked under copyright. The principles are very much the same principles that we're dealing with today. The difference is we weren't dealing in that stage with the digital element, it seems to me. My own office is in Fumbley Square, right in the heart of Dublin, and the lane that runs beside me, Fumbley Lane, and the word itself, you can see why did it appeal to the musician in Joyce, appears in Ulysses. Second vignette is Ireland, and going back to what David was talking about in terms of the Canadian experience, Ireland brought forward its copyright legislation in the year 2000. I was involved in some of that, but one of the interesting pieces that came out of it was the question of exception for education. The legislation itself is very, very detailed, and it did try to balance the fair dealing that David has mentioned in the Canadian context with what I heard Thomas refer to as optional compensation. We have, for instance, in our piece, David, we have an exception for education of 5% is free, and we talked earlier on about what can you copy. It was the same type of argument. But what was written into legislation, interesting enough, was a payment that went back. So higher education found itself with a payment of €6 per head per student. Now, when you looked at the higher education landscape, that meant we went from nothing to 1.5 million overnight by a stroke of a pen. For use of material. Now, how that was going to be distributed is another interesting debate. So we put together a cross higher education group, which I contributed to, and we managed to get a phased approach in terms of that payment. But that there was payment was a fact. The third vignette is the one that's referenced here, and it's one that's currently going on. And I just want to acknowledge the work of groups such as Knowledge Transfer Ireland and the Higher Education Authority in this. And it's on a review, as you can see, of intellectual property management. This comes out of a couple of cases in Ireland which have really got people thinking, and it goes to the heart of what we're talking about here, the role of research and IP within the Irish system. I'll just switch on there. There is recognition through the report that was done at the commercialization, as you can see there, of intellectual property is an important area of activity for all of higher education institutions worldwide, supporting broad mission. But what was happening here was, in our increasing age of accountability, there were two issues emerging. One was ownership of IP, and the second one was accountability, and particularly how it linked back into governance. Because if the general public was looking at public servants being paid more while they were being paid out of the public purse for advantages, or what were seen to be advantages coming out of research, this was raising various matters of interest that were starting to find expression in the political arena. Now, the general public wouldn't necessarily understand all of the detail that goes into IP policy, or indeed they wouldn't necessarily understand that the researcher's time, personal time, had gone into that, and maybe even some financial contribution had gone into this. But a lot of this is actually around perception. The background context for this was we did have a technology transfer strengthening initiative that came through in 2012 based on an original piece in 2007. And these are interesting pieces. There was a national IP protocol put forward in 2016. And then we established Knowledge Transfer Ireland in 2013 that has done much to clarify work in this area. And it acts as the conduit between the research base and then translation into industry. And then we also have a national policy for research commercialization, which came out in 2012. The current focus is really around potential conflict of interest in relation to spin-out companies. Now, here's where Karen and I think probably have much more in common than might have been anticipated. There is a recognition at heart that, of the conflict itself, but also that the scrutiny on public governance, apologies, just that there is a benefit that should attach to the creators of that IP. So the question is, what's the balance of that particular benefit? You'll notice the second line there, and it's interesting how this is located. It says that the appropriate and desirable HEI should benefit from commercialization and should provide incentives to researchers involved in creating the IP. So it's localized within the institution, but then it's devolved to the researchers themselves. The question is how one gives visibility and consistency to that. There were 5 key areas for focus out of that report. One was around communication and dissemination of policy. Second one was about consistency of processes. The third was the conflict of interest piece. And what was happening up to here was that tended to lie upon the individual researcher. And they wanted to transfer the focus of that onto the management of the institute, to take the pressure off the individual teacher or researcher. Then spin-outs. What were the equity stakes, including the input model into spin-outs, if one had an innovation center and you had a spin-out coming from that. And then obviously the whole question of ownership was the final piece. And there's a whole series of recommendations which I'll not go through, but they follow logically from what is stated there. Just, Chairman, if I may finish with just some reflections, just from listening this morning. Thomas talked of the single digital market. I'm just conscious while we have this broader discussion that when you start, and it's a good thing to have, when you start talking about markets and you locate education within a market, you immediately have attention. And that's something that seems to me has informed a lot of the discussion. There is a question that was brought up, I think, earlier this morning in one of the papers that I read from ETUCE, and it was around digital recording of lectures of classes and who owns that. That's a really interesting piece. In my previous role, which was Vice President for Academic Affairs, I recall a particular incident where lecturers came to me making a very good argument that they did not want someone coming in with a recording instrument and recording lectures in class for all sorts of very good reasons. And they made very cogent arguments. The difficulty on the other side was we had provided that piece of recording equipment to a student who had a disability and who'd been advised to use that recording equipment in order to be able to manage their course. Now, how do you balance that type of, and so that, you know, and we all recognize the tensions that lie there. There are, and we haven't talked much about it today, but there are distinctive challenges, it seems to me, within the area of the creative arts. My own background is in music, and you know, and we know from the whole of arts, it's one factor, I think, that, and culture was indeed mentioned this morning by Thomas, in fairness. On the question that David mentioned of balanced rights, and they've come out a few times, how do you balance creator and user, and how do you get exceptions for education and clarity around those? Including protections for teachers and students. It's, again, very, very difficult within a broader piece of legislation or advice that's got to cover everything. What I think from our point of view would be absolutely critical is that the instrument itself shouldn't become a barrier to access for knowledge, and particularly in relation to those who are more economically deprived. And some of what's emerging has the potential, it seems to me, to do that. Mention was made earlier on by Aleksander, which I thought was very good, around Creative Commons. Again, the whole of the enhancement of the teaching and learning agenda within Ireland could not have happened without that open and generous access through Creative Commons. So with that, I just say thank you. Thank you, Chair, very much.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for your comments and reflections, including the wider issues around creative arts and culture and some of the different issues around that, and also your issues around access, disability, and different types of groups. So thank you for that. And now we come to our final panelist. Again, perspective more from the institutions. And we have Damian Harish, who is a civil servant in the Slovenian Ministry of Education, and he's going to tell us something around the Slovenian copyright model. So, Damian, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you. My name is Damian Harish, and thank you for inviting me here. I work as a secretary in the cabinet of Slovenian Ministry of Education, Science and Sport. I cover the field of ICT and education, and I am not an expert in copyright. Well, today we are talking about copyright. We all know that there is a big copyright reform. There is a process of that reform, and it will affect the national copyright legislation of all European Union member states. And we, as the Ministry of Education, are most interested of that part which concerns education, exception for education. And as we all know, the education process changes. I mean, we have new technology, new way of cooperation, online cooperation, and we really think that copyright system should change. But our question is the directive on copyright, which is happening right now, really that change that educational sector needs or wishes for? So, as I said, we have our own national legislation. Now we don't have any general exception for education, and sometimes we even don't know, because we have a legal license for textbooks and exceptions mainly for public performances and communication to the public of works in the form of direct teaching. So, for example, if we have some online uses of works, we don't know if it's covered by legal license or with exceptions for teaching. But, for example, we know that if a teacher sends some copyright publishing materials to students, it is not covered by any of those rights. So yes, our system is outdated and we need to change it. So what our ministry does, well, of course, we respect copyrights. We even did some improvements. We signed some agreement about photocopying of materials in schools. But what we need the most is balanced systems, balanced copyright system, which on one side protects and awards authors, and on the other side it ensures the sharing of knowledge and the promotions of science and research for the benefits of all. So for the very first time we organized a copyright task force at the ministry. I mean, we have a big law office at our ministry, but actually, and I guess there's also in other ministries of education, there was nobody who was specifically expert for this copyright law. So that's why we engage external copyright expert, which helps us with these questions. And what we do, our task force is involved in intergovernmental talks with some others stakeholders from some other ministries. As you can see, there are ministries of economics, ministries of culture, and Ministry of Public Administration. And this group is led by Intellectual Property Office, which is under Ministry of Economic Development and Technology. And what we want to do is to build a common Slovenian position. And we have different views, different opinions, especially with Intellectual Property Office. I mean, I would say it very simply, but they are on the side of authors, and of course we are too. We want that copyrights are respected, but still we want to have, like I said, balanced system that it also goes in the benefits of education. So what kind of copyright system we want? Well, for us it's crucial quality education. It is also crucial that we have access to quality educational resources, even open educational resources, because we, especially our ministry, is very active in open educational resources. We are partners of many educational and research organizations. So yes, we want balanced copyright system with mandatory and broad and open exception to copyright. So if we go to, if we go to the proposal of directive, where we have some issues with which proposals, I will start with text and data mining. Well, our ministry believes that the right to read is the right to mine. So it's that text and data mining shouldn't be limited only for research organizations and cultural and heritage institutions, but for all purposes, not just for scientific research. So it means that also they can do it I mean, the students can do it, private researchers, social enterprises, NGOs, and media. It should be open, mandatory exception. The thing which is the most interesting for us is exception for education. We believe that every entity and individual that is involved in the educational activity for non-commercial purposes should use this exception. And also, it's not only, I mean, the modern teaching is not happening only in schools. It is cooperating, online content sharing, video conferencing. It should not only be happening in school premises, but also outside of some kind of secured networks. Because also, I mean, it's hard to imagine that school has that kind of secured network that can cooperate, and also it's very expensive for the schools to maintain that kind of network. And also there is, as we heard before, there is whenever a payable license is available, then the teaching exception can be excluded. We think that that's not a good idea. Also to other things, there is proposal for new ancillary copyright for press publisher. Is the so-called linking tax. That means that news aggregators and search engines, when they link to some content platform, they will have to pay for it. And that also means that some information will not be accessible to user because they won't be there, because they will not pay for that links. And it's not very clear because it's to who applies to all digital users. So if somebody sends email with some links, will have to pay for it, and it's not very clear which end user are exempted. And also there is a proposal for free internet obligations for upload platforms. We strongly oppose the introduction of mandatory upload filter for information service provider, because it is hard for this kind of system to distinguish and recognize free use, to recognize which can be used as exemption. And it also goes in directions of limits of freedom of speech. And also I believe in excessive self-regulation, because when teachers are not sure if they can publish something, they just won't do it because they don't want to have problems and be afraid that somebody will do something. And this can also bring some financial burdens for internet service providers, especially for the small ones, because that one could not afford that kind of system, or they will have to pay for it from the big service providers. And it also is not clear who is going to judge the appropriateness of the content. So on the end, I would like to say that our ministry is determined to be actively involved in the process of this copyright reform. Also, we expect from the other ministries, from the other countries to be more actively involved. Till now, we didn't get any support, but I believe that they're not organized yet in this kind of way. So, thank you.
Thank you, Damian, for highlighting the kind of proactive approach of the Slovenian ministry in relation to this issue, and also highlighting some of the concerns that you have around the copyright directive, which of course is the leads us next into the next item after coffee. We do have maybe time for certainly one, maybe two questions before we break for coffee. So I can see two there, so don't take those two. Can you say who you are and where you're from, please?
Yes, hello. My name is Sandra Chastanet, and I am a board member of IFRO, which is the International Federation of Reproduction Rights Organizations. And I actually have a comments for David Robinson and Damian Harish. I think it was very interesting to hear that you are seeking balance between users and creators, which is obviously what we want. And well, for the Canadian situation, which is a worry actually for us, I think that seeking to have free use of what you actually add under license for a very marginal cost, which is not a burden neither for teachers or students, is actually not seeking a balanced system because there is no more remuneration for creators, and this remuneration, unlike what you said, is a consistent part of the remuneration for the authors. So I think we can discuss to be sure to have a real balanced system for education. And actually, the same remark for Damian Harish, because I think as you have a collecting organization in Slovenia, which is SAZOR, and I think you have an agreement for photocopy with them, as you said, with a compulsory collective management system, which is very favorable for users because it gives access to an international repertoire. And I think it is a very balanced system. And maybe one idea would be to have the exact same system for digital use rather than a broad exceptions which won't bring balance to your education system. So this is just an idea.
Thank you for that comment. And the final one to Patrick Montfort.
Merci. Je vais parler en français, donc que les collègues aient le temps peut-être de mettre leurs écouteurs. Donc, Patrick Montfort, je suis chercheur au CNRS en France, secrétaire général ou président du syndicat national des chercheurs scientifiques. On a beaucoup parlé ce matin du problème des droits d'auteur liés à l'éducation et donc à la problématique de l'usage en termes d'enseignement. On n'a pas évoqué, et c'est quand même relié fortement aussi la problématique des droits d'auteur dans la publication scientifique, qui est aussi bien sûr un support qui peut servir de support dans l'enseignement, notamment l'enseignement supérieur. La question aujourd'hui, c'est que nous sommes confrontés à un problème de coût de plus en plus fort sur la problématique des revues. Vous savez qu'aujourd'hui, il y a un mouvement international pour se désengager des grands éditeurs qui aujourd'hui imposent des coûts exorbitants. Actuellement en France, il y a des négociations avec Elsevier qui sont arrêtées, donc plus de publications pour 2018 accessibles. Et aujourd'hui, le milieu peut reprendre en main aussi ce qu'il a cédé. Je pense que c'est le même problème dans l'enseignement et l'éducation. C'est nous-mêmes qui avons créé cette question du transfert des droits d'auteur. Et une des questions d'ailleurs que j'ai, qui n'a jamais été claire en tant que scientifique, quand nous donnons nos droits d'auteur aux revues, j'ai jamais compris s'il y avait une vraie base juridique à donner les droits d'auteur à une revue, donc à se déposséder de nos droits d'auteur en tant que lorsqu'on publie, puisque une fois qu'on les a donnés, on n'a même plus l'usage de notre propre article. Je pense qu'aujourd'hui, on peut reprendre en main cette question, et si l'enseignement et la recherche sont bien des biens communs, il faut aujourd'hui que l'usage de ce que le milieu produit revienne un bien commun. Je ne suis pas persuadé, malheureusement, et même si on peut arriver à des équilibres, à ce qu'on arrive un jour à des équilibres, et peut-être que si les enseignants et les chercheurs reprennent bien ce qu'ils diffusent, je vous rappelle qu'autrefois, c'était les sociétés savantes qui diffusaient les publications, et les sociétés savantes, c'était des associations à but non lucratif. Je pense qu'on a un problème qui se repose sur cette question. Et donc, il faut aussi réaborder cette question, comment dans un mouvement général, on peut aussi se réapproprier ce qui est produit en termes d'éducation. Merci.
Thank you, Patrick. I don't know if anyone wanted to say something in response to that. Finally, David?
Sure, just very quickly on the intervention from IFRO, it will come as no surprise. I disagree profoundly. The industry is changing rapidly. More and more content is available in open access, alternative formats. Why should we be paying higher and higher fees for material that's freely available? There's a fundamental change in the industry, and collective licensing agencies have to recognize that, or they will become history. In fact, I would say that what collective licensing agencies in Canada have engaged in, aside from misinformation, I mean, we're not stealing stuff and not paying for it. Fair dealing is very restrictive. But aside from that, is they're engaged in rent-seeking behavior. That's as simple as it is. On Patrick's intervention, one of the things that we've tried to negotiate along with the Canadian Association of Research Libraries is an amendment to agreements with publishers for academic journals. So when you as an academic write an article for a journal, you often have to sign over the copyright. We've negotiated an addendum that keeps the copyright with the individual. So it allows the individual then to make it available through a Creative Commons license, to put it into an open access repository. Unless the academics, and I guess to pick up on Karen's point, unless the academics have control over copyright, you cede control to big publishers who are going to lock it down, and that's a problem.
Thank you very much, David, for your comments, and for every single panelist here, and for your for comments at the end, and for listening to all the presentations. We are now stopping for coffee until 11:30, and where we return here for a further discussion on the EU Copyright Directive. So please help yourself to coffee and at the back of the hall. So thank you, everyone.
Hello everyone, my name is Maja Bogataj. I come from Slovenia. I'm very delighted to be here. Thank you very much to be invited to this wonderful event. We are going to start the session. However, one of the presenters, namely the parliamentarian, Mr. Axel Voss, is going to join us, but is going to come a little bit later. So we are going to first start with presentation as proposed on the agenda, with the title "The Position of Education Trade Unions on the Copyright Reform at EU Level." Who is presenter is going to be Eduardo Nadal, who is Policy Officer at the European Trade Union Committee for Education. He is responsible for occupational health, safety, equality, and digitalization, so he is well aware that the copyright is also very important. So, Eduardo, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you very much, Maja. It's really an honor to be in this panel with COMMUNIA partners. Unfortunately, the copyright rapporteur will be joining us a bit later than expected. So I will be presenting the position of education trade unions from ETUCE on the ongoing copyright debate at European level. As we all know, the Commission is finalizing the initiative to pass a directive on copyright, and this will have a great impact on the work of teachers, academics, as well as education employers, organizations, and students. And we are actually looking forward to see the final position of the Parliament in this regard. So within this copyright proposal, ETUCE welcomes the concept of the copyright exception or limitation for education, as well as the text and data mining exception for research purposes, as it provides a more diverse choice of learning materials and resources for teachers and researchers. Actually, a genuine exception for education can contribute to the development of cross-border cooperation between institutions, teachers, and researchers in the EU. Furthermore, such an important exception would relieve teachers and researchers of the fear of breaking the law when using online resources and materials for their works, and eliminates legal uncertainty about digital materials. However, it's very important to note that education and the content of educational materials is an exclusive competence of national competence of member states. And instead of imposing a mandatory rule on a European education system that varies significantly across the EU, the Commission should rather promote social dialogue and collective agreements in the education sector, introducing social partners as key actors in negotiations on national copyright regulations. In any case, we support the Commission proposal to remove the copyright restrictions on the digital use of illustrative materials for educational purposes, as such an action would reduce the financial burdens on education systems and institutions, most of which are already paying substantial licensing fees to provide students and teachers with access to teaching and learning materials. We alert the licensing schemes primarily benefit for-profit private companies and contribute to indirect privatization and commercialization of education. I think my colleague Teresa from COMMUNIA would be also mentioning the topic of licensing afterwards. However, in this respect, we believe that the Commission possibility to allow member states to opt out from the copyright exception for education in some cases where adequate licenses are easily available in the market should be clarified in the final copyright directive, as well as who should monitor the availability and existence of this license in practice. Apart from the provision of teacher training to teachers and academics on copyright issues, remuneration is a fundamental issue. The copyright exception for educational purposes must indeed include safeguards for fair remuneration and correct attribution of the creative and intellectual work of teachers and researchers. Educational establishments should be prevented from forcing their employees to sign unbalanced contracts where all the intellectual rights and transferred to the institutions they are working for without any restriction and with any kind of compensation. Some members of the European Parliament are already proposing mandatory remuneration for educational uses. But currently, around 70 member states have exceptions for educational purposes that are completely or largely unremunerated. In these countries, educators can use copyrighted works for educational purposes for free. However, we do believe that payments should therefore remain optional within each particular national education system, and any potential change to those national models should be consulted with education unions and the Ministries of Education of all member states. In view of the large disparities of the existing copyright models across member states, where in some countries teachers and researchers can be considered more as authors of academic works, while in other countries they can be seen rather as final users of academic works, the Copyright Directive is particularly challenging, and it should address both the rights of creators and the rights of users in a balanced way, and in the context of education, knowledge, and research, to ensure the respect of the rule of law and safety standards. Indeed, the use of copyrighted protected materials in education and research pose a very big challenge when those materials are produced by teachers and academics in their private time. Those materials should not be prepared at their own cost. This is the reason why fair remuneration for teachers and academics for their creative and intellectual work is fundamental. Other key elements related to the proposal is the quality assurance of the freely available teaching materials. Often digital materials on internet may include hazardous and harmful content and untrue facts. In this regard, the copyright proposal is not clear on how the quality and suitability of this educational content of exempted digital materials can be assured. ETUCE suggested, for example, that these open educational resources should be given a standard set of metadata so teachers can look them up, index, and filter them efficiently. In the end, a final question which is particularly relevant and should be clarified throughout this conference is how to reduce copyright infringements and how to ensure the legitimate access of students to the online learning materials. Indeed, at European level, it seems that the Commission proposal makes no reference to the open access initiative proposed within the European Open Science Strategy. Open access is essential for Europe's position to freely share knowledge by supporting the open dissemination of publicly funded research. It has significant implications for copyrights in the digital market that should be taken into account in order not to weaken the effort to develop an open and safe access environments that help reduce copyright infringement and ensure legitimate access of students to freely online learning materials. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. The panel here agreed that we will give floor next to another representative of another union, this time representative of a student union. I invite Adam Gaik, who is Vice President of European Student Union, to present their or his position on students' unions on the copyright reform currently taking place at the EU level. So, Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maja. So, I wanted to thank a lot to the Educational International and ETUCE for inviting us. We really think that cooperation of all stakeholders is a very important value in any consultation process. And since we are facing now the reform of the copywriting in the EU, all of the voices of the stakeholders should be heard and should be discussed. So thank you a lot for also not forgetting about students, which are very often users of the learning materials prepared by teachers. Anyway, I would like to go with you a little bit through the students' perspective on the reform. There are some issues which are quite concerning for us, which are also a little bit different than probably for teachers, since we are also the we also are the creators of the learning materials, but also we are mostly users. So we have also quite a lot of concerns about what is going to happen. So a little bit of guidance and going through just happening now. So can I guess? Oh, thank you. Like this, yeah? Yeah, great. So starting with the very basics, we have quite a lot of policies about the copyrights as the organization which gathers 45 national unions of students throughout Europe. So we altogether represent around 12 million of students in Europe. So we also find the international agreements as something what is also very valuable for our work and also like a source for our policies. One of them are, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which also states that the right to intellectual property produced by people is their own right as a human right. But also what's important, that right to education also is something what is a human right, and this we really believe that the copywriting and the reforms and the approach of the education should be like a equation of both human rights, like to your own intellectual property, but also to the education. So what I'm going to discuss now is like a little bit of introduction to our policies on copywriting, then our response to what has been proposed, and our remarks on what not has been proposed, but we think it should have been. So our policies on copywriting, they are based on two fundaments. One is the education as a public responsibility, and one is the quality of education and like what's the intellectual property role in both of these extremely important features of education. And like to go to something more accessible in reading here. We really think that first, either research is publicly funded, even partially, should be publicly accessible. So if we are starting from the point of view that education and research are public goods, and also because they are publicly funded, they also should be publicly accessible. Then that remunerations, that is what Eduardo has said, they should be adequate for the work. And like from our point of view, also it's important that we can't forget that also a lot of students do a lot of work to make the publications or research being done and being published, and also their remuneration for this work has to be adequate, what also applies to this reform. Then strengthening the open education, and open education is extremely important thing which makes the access to education, to research, to development, to the society equal. And especially in the integrating Europe, the open education is a chance for all of us to actually equalize access to education between countries and the regions, and especially between the people. And then the role of research for the development of communities, so the societal role of the research should also be in mind, that it also should have impact on the development of the people. So then going to the policy connected with education, we really think that first, students' rights to their intellectual property should be protected. So students very often struggle with the fact that we produce some intellectual property during our learning process, but then very often its status, legal status, is unknown. Very often the rights are signed over to a university, to a supervisor. So this is a thing which is also a problem a lot of students have to face. Then information about the rights, training about the rights. Like most of students in Europe, they go through the intellectual property courses. Like me, myself, I studied like 3 programs. Each program started with the online course on intellectual property, and I can guarantee that like most of students had no idea about it after all. Since like the focus to its relevance, it's really not in place. So this is something what is extremely important. And then any infringement, sorry for a linguistic mistake, should be followed by adequate consequences always. So then, to go to the reform itself, first, students' place in the reform, like we do not see it. The institutional, the place for institutions, research institutions is there. They are defined in the directive as the researchers, but we do not see like the place for students, for the other stakeholders in the academic community there. What also is later reflect in the right for the data mining. So data mining is also possible for the researchers according to the directive, where is the place for the individuals, where is the place for the teachers who are not researchers, where is the place for students, which also may use it for research purposes. And it was said today a couple of times that the right to read should be a right to mine, and this is something what should be rather a principle, not an exception. Then learning and teaching. This is something what actually research should have a great, profound influence on. And if we want to do a publicly access or like research, or we want to have a research which makes progress in our societies, it has to be used for learning and teaching. Like otherwise, why to even do it? So maybe I'm over-exaggerating, but learning and teaching, this is such an important value and side of the research. So we really believe that exceptions for learning and teaching should be mandatory, and not only for teaching, for learning itself, because if a teacher uses research data with research materials, okay, that's great, but still students have to learn, yeah? So so learning should be on the same place as a teaching, and should be also valuable. And it doesn't mean it doesn't concern only the data mining, also like the open platforms where a lot of students and teachers share their materials, their learning materials. I think this is something what also should be in place in the directive. Then transparency. There is an article 14 which says that if not significant performance is being given to a publication, then the rights may not apply. This is something what we feel very tricky. As I said before, quite a lot of students struggle with the fact that their role in the publications are diminishing. So I think this is something what should be really be given like a second thought on how we can protect also people who their rights are not fully protected at their universities, also in terms of what they publish. So what is missing? For sure, focus on open education. I think that we all really believed that open education will be much more in focus of the EU. As I said before, this is something what makes societies more equal, which makes the people access to development more equal, and this is something what works beyond the borders. So this is something what for us is like the future of education, and we believe this is something what is also key for the balanced development of Europe. Also, cross-border access to research should also be in place. So all the places in Europe, no matter where they are, if they are in the rich or poor regions, they should have equal access to the research. Trainings on the copyrights for the academic communities, so people are really aware of what are their rights, how to protect them, and to make sure that everybody's rights are really protected and they are safe. And the societal purpose of research, we should really remember that research makes sense when it has impact on societies, when it's accessible for learning, for teaching, and for making people to develop their potential. Then it has a really great impact, and this is why it should be publicly funded. Yep. So you can follow my organization on this through these channels, and thank you a lot for this intervention.
very much for this perspective on the copyright reform, which is really an interesting, pressing, and important issue taking place right now in European Union. Most of you here, being educators, really work with the biggest treasures of our lives, which are our children, our future, and many things is really important in how the quality of the education will develop, and copyright is obviously one of the things. Whether the current proposal that is at the table really answers all the questions, it's a very pressing issue, and many of us would be very critical. I usually use a metaphor as like a boy who was asking for a bike to be able to drive to school every day. This is educational sector asking for a good reform for a very long time. And finally, the boy got a bike. And at the beginning, it was very happy because it has a bike. But this bike, it seems it doesn't have round wheels. So it's still many things that need to be prepared that this bike would be functional. And Teresa Nobre, who is our next presenter will present what is copyrights and copyright wrongs in Europe. She did extensive comparative research on licensing agreement in copyright frameworks in Europe. Teresa was, before of this research, also in charge of comparative research about exceptions and limitation in education, and she very graphically also, because showed the results that the European educational framework is really fragmented, and there is an urgent need for harmonization and also like urgent need to adjustments of copyrights. Teresa Nobre is a lawyer, expert in copyright. She's a legal expert on copyright at COMMUNIA, International Association on the Digital Public Domain, and she's also Creative Commons Portal Legal Lead. And Teresa, the floor is yours. She's going to present, as I said before, comparative research on licensing agreements in copyright frameworks in Europe.
Thank you so much. So I want to focus in one aspect of this reform, which are license priority. The fact that we will have an exception for educational uses that can be override by license agreements. So agreements between right holders and schools, or between right holders and ministries of education. And I think it's one of the very first things that I want to mention here is that this reform, and when we talk about an exception for education, we are not talking about a relationship between an employee and an employer. So I know that, for instance, for the unions, that relationship is, of course, very important, but we are not talking about teachers being remunerated by the work they do for the employers. So we are talking about, when we're talking about remuneration in relation to this reform, we are talking about remuneration of things such as the ones that are mentioned on those graphics, which are the results of my research. Things like performing a play in school, showing a YouTube video in classroom, using an image of a copyrighted material in your own presentation. We are talking about these kind of uses. And when you are talking about this reform and about an exception, this exception is a legal permission for teachers and students to do these kind of things, these educational activities that involve copyrighted works. Okay, so the first thing that I want you to know is that in this proposal, we will have a minimum standard, so a minimal level of harmonization, where we have the same rules all over Europe for certain uses, so such as if a teacher wants to watch a YouTube video in class or share a material in the school's internet with their students, he can do it, and you will have the same rules all over Europe, because he is allowed under the same law, which is this law that is now this so-called copyright exception that we have been talking all morning, and that is in this new proposal that the European Commission representative, Mr. Thomas, presented earlier in this session. So first, what the European Commission proposes is to have the same rules all over Europe. But then, so this is the first article, and you know lawyers can be very complex, and they give you something and they take you something back, right on the next rule. So the first rule is that we'll have the same rules all over Europe for educational uses of copyrighted materials in educational activities. And the second rule is completely different. The second rule says that if there's a license to watch that YouTube video or to share that material in the school's internet, you can no longer rely on the law, you have to buy a license. Okay? So this means different licenses, different rules all over Europe. So the idea that we were trying to harmonize everything, we won't if we have licenses that have their own rules, and will fragment again the whole idea of having the similar rules all over Europe. And let me tell you something, we are not talking about remuneration. When we're talking about licenses, it's just not a question of remuneration. It's a question of having specific rules that are imposed or agreed or imposed, normally imposed, on these licenses by right holders. We are talking about setting aside the rules that lawmakers define on the law, on that first number that I mentioned, setting aside those rules and replacing them with rules that are in these agreements that mostly are defined by right holders, because schools don't really have much power in negotiating such licenses. Because how much power can you have when the law says, look, you have to stop using the work as you have been using under the exception, under the law, and you have to buy a license. You don't have any power to negotiate anything if the law says that. It's either that or nothing. So that's why we are concerned, because teachers will have to buy, or the schools have to buy those licenses to keep using the works. And I was saying that this is different from remuneration, because you can have an exception, which is a law that says these uses are paid, and that's different. That's a remunerated exception. And that's when right holders say that they want remuneration, they should be saying that they want that, a remunerated exception. They should not be saying that they want a license. That's a different thing. That's setting your own rules, your own private rules with private agreements. But still, speaking about remuneration, I should inform you that the majority of countries in the European Union, we're talking about 18 countries, don't foresee any remuneration for educational uses. So the majority of laws in the European Union consider that it's fair to make certain uses for educational purposes without paying for it. Okay? And we have countries with very different financial structures, very different budgets for education. I can tell you that in my country, Portugal, we don't have budget to pay for each and every use of copyrighted materials for educational purposes in schools. And that's why, well, that's why I'm a bit surprised that teachers might be asking for paying for uses of other people in classrooms. Anyway, moving forward. So we are concerned about that, and we decided to make an analysis of educational licenses in 3 countries: France, United Kingdom, and Finland. They have all different licenses. I'm not going to explain them to you. I'm just going to present you some examples of some of those rules that are contained in those licenses, rules that we are concerned about. Because when you give priority to licenses, those are the licenses that you will have. So, also because the European Commission in 2006, and that's also one of the problems of the licenses. So remuneration is a problem, and more than 30% of the teachers that were surveyed by the European Commission to discuss copyright-related obstacles faced by teachers in their daily activities. One of the most cited obstacles was, I or my school could not afford the price of the license. Okay, so remuneration is a real problem for schools and teachers. And then, as I was saying, licenses have other clauses that impose more restrictions than the ones that are foreseen in the law, and more obligations than the ones that are foreseen on the law. So we'll see now the examples. So for instance, and these are examples that I picked up from the licenses that I've analyzed. So for instance, one of those licenses say that schools must own or subscribe to a copy of the materials they can copy, scan, or use under the license. What does this mean? It means that if the teacher or the student owns the material, it cannot fall under the license. So it's the school that has to buy the material. Or if the teacher or the student wants to pick a material that's freely available online, a YouTube video, it doesn't own it. He hasn't subscribed to it. Can he use it? I don't think so under this clause of this license. If the teacher wants to borrow it from a library, he also cannot use it. Okay, so this is a real example of a clause that I saw in a license. There are, of course, other licenses that say you can use material that is borrowed, you can use material that is otherwise legally acquired, so obtained legally from the internet, etc. But there is one license that contains this. So don't tell me that it does not, because I've seen it with my own eyes. And it's there in the research that I did. So you can see where does it come from. So another clause that I've seen in the licenses is, for instance, this one that says that teachers, when they make digital copies under the license, they cannot put hyperlinks to any external or third-party website. It's like you make a scan, or you type it yourself, because typing is already creating a digital copy of something, and you cannot put a link to a third-party website. This, of course, prevents comparison verification. Everyone needs to link to something else, and this is prevented by this license. Then you have things that are a bit more problematic, and I should warn you already that I'm not a data protection lawyer. I'm a copyright lawyer. So, of course, we now have a new regulation, the GDPR, that might protect some of these things, but this is what I saw in a license, or in several licenses, by the way, in all the British licenses, for instance, that I've analyzed. So licensors can expect materials and networks, storage platforms of the schools, and of course collect data without any restrictions. So they don't have confidentiality obligations. They don't have a restriction not to use and share those materials with third parties, not to make commercial uses of such data. And that means, student performance data and other sorts of data. And these licenses are in effect nowadays, so before the GDPR. Even if the GDPR is going to protect some of this, I don't know, I have no idea. We need a data protection lawyer here. The truth is, I'm a licensed lawyer. When I'm not talking about copyright in education, I'm a licensed lawyer. I have never seen a license between two parties that have equal negotiating powers. I have never seen a license that allows the licensor to collect data from the licensee and is not obliged to confidentiality. So this is the first time in my career as a licensed lawyer that I've seen licenses that allow you to collect data from your licensee and not being obliged to confidentiality, and not being obliged to just use the data you collect for the purposes of ensuring compliance and not for any other purposes. And we know data is very valuable nowadays. So another example, and I'm almost terminating, I'm not sure if I still have time. Another example of a clause that I've seen is this one that allows licensors to enter the school premises at any time, as many times they want, provided they give reasonable notice to schools to ensure compliance, of course, with the license and inspect procedures. I've never, we had a Twitter, of course, there's a lot of discussions that then go on Twitter. I don't say, the license says this, I don't say that this allows, I didn't think that right holders would enter the classroom, but someone mentioned that could mean enter the classroom, which, of course, it allows to enter the classroom, but I was actually thinking about the school's premises as being the administrative spaces. And this, of course, can disrupt the normal operation of schools. Again, my experience as a lawyer says that licensors can do this like once a year, not at any times, as many times as they want. Finally, I think this is the last one, schools have to ensure that licenses are not infringed by teachers and students. How can you control all your students and all your teachers when you are, a big university? How can you ensure that they don't infringe the licenses, that they don't make copies that are illegal or that are that have an extent that is not foreseen by the license? They take 40 pages instead of the 30 that are allowed by the license. I think this is an excessive burden that is created by the license on the schools, because I don't really think that schools should policy anyone. This is another example of a bad clause. Of course, you have licenses that don't have this type of clauses, okay? Just to be sure that we have fair licenses, but we also have unfair. And I'm concerned about the unfair type of clauses that I've seen, not, of course, about the fair ones. So my conclusion is licenses can be disadvantageous to schools if schools have no power to negotiate them. And they won't have any power if the law says that you are forced to buy a license, forced in the sense that you have to stop using the word if you don't buy the license. So you won't have any power if that's the case. My understanding, and I think that's an important point too, is that schools will still, even if the law doesn't give priority to licenses over the law, schools will still have an incentive to buy licenses if those licenses grant more rights than the ones granted by the law. So for instance, if they allow you to use an entire book, because the law doesn't allow you to use an entire book, okay? Or uses on the open internet, or if the product is so good that you really want that product, you want to buy that license, okay? There's still gonna be, no one is gonna, licenses will not end if we don't give priority to licenses, okay? So solutions is, don't allow licenses to take precedence over exceptions. If you want to give precedence to anything, give it to mutually agreed licenses, things that both parties have agreed on, and not license offers. So one party defining the terms and conditions alone. With regards to licenses that have terms that are more restrictive than the ones foreseen by the law, those terms should have no effect, should be unenforceable. You cannot use a license to set aside the law, a good law in this case. Give schools mechanisms to easily challenge unfair license terms. So affordable mediation or litigation. I know Professor Lionel Bentley told me that the UK had an important case where the universities challenged the terms of a license and they paid £800,000 in costs. How many schools in this Europe can pay this kind of costs? So probably lawmakers have to think about mechanisms to ensure affordable mediation and litigation. Finally, if you really find, if you assess the licenses after after a certain period that I would suggest to be 3 years after this new law is implemented, if you assess the licenses and see that they are constantly having unfair terms, you have to consider submitting them to regulation. So setting your own rules. And that's all. You can see my study here.
Thank you very much, Teresa. So, very rough conclusion, licenses are not really the best way to go forward with the reform. But what is the best way to go forward with the reform, or what is the current status of the reform? The best news will come from Axel Voss, who is a member of European Parliament, member of Christian Democratic Union of Germany, which is part of the European People's Party. Mr. Voss is member of Committee on Legal Affairs, and he was entrusted with a difficult task to overview the copyright reform in the European Parliament last July. Mr. Voss, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and
So when I took over this dossier, I didn't expect that this is so controversial in these different sectors and has a lot of stakeholders and associations and interest groups and so on and on. And so after a while I realized this is more difficult than I expected it from the beginning. So, but please have in mind this is only a directive. So you have also to be aware that the member states at the end will transfer this to their national laws, and the national law then will be the most important part of this. Of course, we are trying to implement some pillars, so this is of course also very important, but we can't go to every little single detail what might should come up or what might or what should be regulated. So at first, please have in mind this is in the directive. Yesterday we talked in the shadows meeting about the timeline, and so just for your information, and this is hopefully the last postponing of the voting in the for the committee. It should be the 20th or 21st of June. This means 1 week before we have to prepare all these papers for this, and so have in mind that the 13th or 15th or so of June might be the deadline for everything what we can do. So if we are then coming to this Article 4 in the directive proposal, so in general this is a question when to pay or when to use free for free of these copyright protected works, and therefore we are implementing this exception or kind of a limitation for educational uses and for educational establishments and regarding teaching activities or educational activities. And the exception probably is justified because we think in Europe educational knowledge, careers, etc. This is one of the most important things what we should do for our citizens, and to be able to educate yourself in a way and our citizens in a way that we will that might be future-proofed and will support our whole society in a way. This is the overall idea of these, and what we are doing now, as I said before, this is in the exception for teaching activities, and here in this copyright proposal for digital use of the educational works of for the copyright protected works. So the digital use, of course, we are thinking about how we can avoid to come to separate legal lines in the analog and digital world, that everything might fit at the end and might be coherent at the end. I'm not sure if we have achieved this already in Article 4 so far, but we are trying to think about these. But please also have in mind the first or primary idea is the digital use of these works. And then this use of these works can only be used for the sole purpose of illustration for teaching. And also this one, and in addition with paragraph 4 of article, paragraph 3 of Article 4, so this is then meant that the educational establishments can use this only in this member state. So not a kind of a cross-border situation. It's the purpose of illustration for teaching only in this member state, because this law is not so harmonized
that we will have in each member state the same rule at the end. So that's why we have to split out, we have to fragment these somehow, that we can't use these exception what then national legislation will be interpreted then will have these only in this member state itself. And an additional requirement there is for only non-commercial purpose, and this is also meant that we are seeing the works of teaching activities, yes, should be remunerated somehow in a way, but if it comes to non-commercial purpose for the whole for our citizens, and so then we are seeing this a little bit more with the exception that there might be a way of using parts of these works for free, or having in mind that there might be also some collective licensing agreements in place, where then probably this will be remunerated somehow in a different way, but not that every teacher has to go to every publisher and asking for using these at the end. No, this should be regulated practically in a way that everyone can use these for educational purposes and non-commercial purposes. Of course, then we are limiting this situation a little bit to the places on the premises of the educational establishments, or because we trying to think digital, also via or through a secure electronic environment. So there might be a way in also having these illustration for teaching via a secure electronic environment. Of course, every time you're using these works for educational uses, then there should be also a kind of an indication of the source, if this is still practical. And I hope in these days this is always practical, but I hope then this might be not that difficult, that you can add also this indication of the source itself. Then in paragraph 2 we have the exception of the exception, then the regarding the collective licensing agreements. I'm sure you have read, all of you, Article 4, so and the recitals, so it's better you will, if you have some questions, please let me know, or if you see some problems here. And in paragraph 4 of Article 4 we have this fair compensation should be provided somehow in a way, but it's up to the member states then to regulate this further. And of course then, because some member states or some publishers also are interested in having this royalty-free license, therefore we are added this paragraph 4a in a way that this is also be available if someone would like to have a situation like this in place. So what we haven't done so far, and that's why I would say Article 4 is not so far the end of everything what we have to be discussed. The book market or the publisher market for books for teaching, or especially for the school business, is not included so far in a way that I would be satisfied. And therefore we will discuss or rediscuss and rethink about how we can
integrate something especially for the school book market situation, because they have a very small market, and then we have to be very careful to use an exception for these. But so far I have to convince all my colleagues from different political groups that there is a necessity for this, and but I'm very confident that we will integrate here something, especially for this situation for the school book market. So I would leave it like this, because unfortunately I have to run 1:45, so that's why.
Maybe we can do the exception. So what I said, that I'm going to open the floor because I'm not going to miss this opportunity to host the Member of Parliament here. So whoever is would like to ask the question, please go ahead. There is a gentleman in the fourth row.
Bonjour, je parlerai en français. Je m'appelle Juan Mendoza. Je suis conseiller du Comité économique et social européen. Et j'ai été aussi le rapporteur de l'avis du Comité économique et social sur le paquet des droits de